Hey guys, welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. In each episode, we're going to have conversations with some of the top investors, superstar founders, as well as well-known tech company executives in Silicon Valley. We'll have a coffee chat with them to learn their way of thinking and actionable tips on how they build or invest in a successful company. Before we start our show today, I want to make sure the listener, aka you, understand that everything a person say on the podcast only reflects hers or his own opinion, not the show or the company they work at. Our guest today is a former CEO of Dunkin Donuts. He took over as the CEO of Dunkin Donuts at age 25 from his father, who was the founder of Dunkin Donuts. In his 35 years run, he grew the company from $10 million in sales to over $2 billion, with more than 3,000 outlets. He served on the board of Domino's Pizza and Sonic Drive-In. His name is Robert Rosenberg. Welcome to the second part of the conversation with Bob. In the last episode, we talked about how Bob started his career at Dunkin Donuts, and if starting all over again, what would he do to scale a business in today's environment? In this episode, we'll focus on learning more about how Bob successfully scaled Dunkin Donuts to a global brand. Please enjoy. So now we have our overall strategy, which is focused on the consumer and be better than everyone else in product and service. We need to get there by hiring the right people. In your book, I think you mentioned about you recruited your friends from Cornell and Harvard. You would drive with a person to go to school all the time, so you already know them really well. But if you and I are starting a business today without knowing many people in the right industry, how do you hire? You mentioned in your book the leader should identify the position, knowing exactly what you need. After identifying that, what's the next step to find them? Would it be looking at who is doing that at a competitor company and approach them?
I would offer three tests, three things that you should do to man the organization well. At least three in terms of staffing. Then there would be other things I would suggest in terms of compensation to keep and motivate, and then morale. But in terms of recruitment, the first thing I would do would be very, very crisp about defining the assignment. What is the job that has to be done? The better you define the assignment, the more likely you are to have a right hit in terms of the person to fill that assignment. Mm-hmm. So, if you are going to be requiring a store manager for a retail site, it certainly would help if someone has been a long tenured store manager for another chain who understood what it was like to recruit and retain a staff and motivate them, that had a proven track record. It's not 100%, but you're going to increase the odds dramatically that you're going to be more successful than if you hired someone off the street, even if you hired a classmate out of college. So in other words, the job that I hired Bill Beebe, who was my drive mate back and forth to business school, was a CFO. He came out of corporate finance from Goldman. I mean, he had the qualifications to be a CFO. Mm-hmm. And, I did break that on a couple of occasions, luckily. But generally speaking, that's the first step. The second step I would pay attention to is complementarity. That there isn't one person that's good for all things. No one suits all needs. And as you put together a team, it is going to be the strength and the complementarity of that team that's going to be successful. So if the marketing person could be different than the operating person, you can have people, and in my team, we had people of different educational levels, different religions, different backgrounds. Unfortunately, didn't have women until later on, until I became aware of the impact of that. Sounds strange. My class at business school, by the way, there were no women. There were no women in business school. Can you imagine that in 1963?
No.
We had 10 women could double register from Radcliffe, but there were no. In my earliest out of 700 people that entered, there was not one woman, not one. So I'm unfortunately a product a little bit of my environment. I came out of the Mad Men era, but basically complementarity. The third thing I would hire for would be something I would call culture. Mm-hmm. Every company has a culture. Everybody has sort of the values and the way they do things. In our case, our culture was team. Our culture was truthfulness, aspirational, no backbiting. And those would be the kind of characteristics that we would try to hire for. Sometimes people don't always disclose themselves in the way you want, but those would be the kind of 3 steps that I would suggest be used to recruit. Now, there's different things when it comes to compensation and different things when it comes to acknowledgement and motivation and care for people. That comes with trust.
In terms of looking for these characteristics, when it comes to execution, how do you follow this guideline? Especially, how do you test out the team chemistry and culture fit to make sure they are complementary to other employees?
Basically through interviews and through exposure to other teammates. In other words, the more you can learn, and I'm a great believer in teaming, so it would be the team that would pass judgment as much as me. But the first thing would be just conversation. Tell me about yourself. Tell me what your successes were, your failures. Same thing you're doing to me now. I would do to a new hire. It's been a long time. I left before LinkedIn was a thing. So that's a new way to hire and a very effective way to network. So I'm not up on all the new technologies that are useful in order to do screening. So my screening was very much face-to-face and a continuing process. And it wasn't just me. I mean, I had one of the key elements on boards that I was on, and in my own situation, I found one of the key elements, one of the most important people on your team is to have a great HR person, someone who really knows people, who's got what I call exquisite taste in people. And I relied heavily on Rick Power, who was my HR guy for years. And I would also rely upon him on delicate negotiation of some of my key reports when I had contract time come up, and some of them were on 5-year contracts. So I have him be my go-between. But I mean, I found, and that would be my advice to other CEOs where I served on boards, make sure you have standing by your side a great HR person that has got a touch and a feel for the organization, that's got really good taste in terms of people, that's got great reach. Now, that's not necessarily possible in a startup, but as you get rolling, one of the key elements as you start to hire people is if you could have someone who's good at HR, that's a huge advantage because no one person necessarily can pick, the right person for the right job in every situation. So it's generally, again, the sort of the strength of the overall assessment of everybody that's helpful in making choices. And we made some mistakes, but not too many. But that was the way we worked. I relied on other people other than myself.
Yeah, Bob, you're a successful CEO. In terms of the technical skill sets, do you define yourself as a sales leader, a marketing leader, or a finance leader?
Marketing. I basically see these companies as marketing companies. Now, that was during the era, I said, was the second era. After the operational era was the marketing era. So again, I fit the assignment for that. I also, I wasn't necessarily better than my peers or different. I just happened to, luckily, coincidentally, my characteristics fit the requirement of the job, the assignment for those areas. Today, it may be a different assignment. It may be someone who also may be more digitally acute because, that's required. So, but I have seen lawyers run companies brilliantly who have great adaptability and who are curious and who have acquired the knowledge in these different technical areas, both marketing and in terms of what I call the digital age, and have successfully bridged those, even though that wasn't their training. It's hard to tell sometimes, but then you find someone who's very curious, who's very honest, and really can define reality, not the world as they would like it to be, but the world as it really is, which is a very critical element, I think, for a leader, the ability to define reality. Hard to do, easy to say, hard to do, because there's a lot of emotion impacted in that. A lot of hard truths you have to come up against about yourself and about your capabilities and about your competition. But in any event, so people that are gifted with those skills may well be able to bridge the gap. But in my case, we were a marketing company. I thought of us as a marketing company, and it was good that I liked marketing. I didn't get trained necessarily in marketing, but I liked it. something I related to.
Yeah.
Generally, you get good at things you like, or you like things you're good at. I mean, I don't know, like a chicken or the egg.
Yeah. What would you say are 3 characteristics that you have your peers don't that make you more successful?
I don't think so. I don't think in those terms. I basically think that the characteristics that I had that fit the assignment in that company at that time, and that's the trick, is not necessarily that they don't have them. They have others. They may even have the same ones I did, but didn't have the opportunity to have a father start a business that he could go into, be that lucky, because luck was a big part of it. Being in the right industry, and my father did that. I didn't do that. He created that. He was smart enough to get out of the way when he realized that he couldn't build it, but maybe he didn't fully get out of the way, but at least he thought he got out of the way. But some of it's luck. But I would say that the characteristics that I had that fit the job were I was aspirational. I liked to win. Mm-hmm. I was collegial. I liked teams. And I was persistent, that when we ran into trouble, I didn't give up, and I think that is one of the most important elements of all, if you're going to build a business, because stuff happens and you're going to run into crises, you're going to run into problems, and the world is lumpy, and you're going to have to live through that. And that's not always easy when everybody else is walking around, woe is me, the sky is falling. You got to be able to say, we'll get through it. We're going to do it. We're going to get to the other side. Follow me over here. We're going over here. So those would be things that, one way or another, through childhood or whatever I was blessed with. And it happened that fit that job at that time. And maybe not at another time.
Those 3 things you said is timeless. I feel like you could be equally successful even if you didn't run Dunkin'. I agree with you on luck is a big factor, but it's just to a certain degree. You were born in the US in a family that supports and allow you to think about business. Then again, if you were born in a different family, started a different business in a different industry, I'm sure you'll still be a superstar because of the way you think and the persistence.
Possibly, but Warren Buffett says that we won the lottery by being born into the United States at this particular point in time. And in my case, I consider myself, and I'm very grateful, eternally grateful. I had a certain amount of luck. I was in the right place at the right time, unfortunately, with the right set of skills. And the rest of it's speculation. We'll never know what would happen if it was a different set of circumstances.
Yeah. Who do you think was on your personal board of advisors? Who are some couple people that you go for as career advice, or where Dunkin' Donuts should go back in time?
Different people came at different times. Some of it came out of books. Some of it came from seminars, particularly about emotional intelligence. And my growing up, which was sort of a long journey, and it's still going on to this day, even at my age. But Archie Southgate, who was a lawyer for Ropes and Gray, was on my board, who helped me at a dire moment, asking the right questions about what we should be doing, and it forced me to think. Milk Brown, another board member, who was one of my old professors from business school, basically helped me really consolidate the company and sell off the other businesses. Tom Schwartz, who was the COO of the company, 20 years, was my teammate and sort of business partner. Complementary skills, great ability to pick great people. Each of them, Sid, all of my teammates were really, really helping me. And then I took courses. I would go to courses. I did, people would call kind of cult-like, but I did ask. I don't know if that word means anything to you in the forum. And I took courses from a guy who was a linguist by the name of Fernando Flores about the power and the importance of language. And it was a continuing matter of education. A lot of it did come from books. My brother always had this saying that stuck with me. He said, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. Yeah. And that was true in my life. I often refer to my own book as a buffet of ideas, and that I know from my own experience that generally if I attended a seminar, if I was having a conversation, or I read a book, I wouldn't get any more than 2 or 3 nuggets. But those nuggets were always around the very issues I was wrestling with in my life at that moment in time, whether it's a personal issue or whether it's a business issue. And, it stuck with me. And I would hope that there'd be things in my book that would so resonate with different people, whether they're designing a life or whether they're trying to become an entrepreneur, whether they're scaling a business through adolescence, or whether they're running a large public company, that there might be something in there that might hit them, that nugget that they might carry away. And that's how I grew, and that's how I got counsel. So it comes from lots of sources. Just being curious and open. Just, realizing that you're still not baked, that you still got a lot of room to grow. And it never stops, I don't think. It's sort of it's a fountain of youth. Is to keep open and keep learning.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love the fact that you're constantly learning, even now. Reading books, going to seminars. I find it really interesting that you took a language class. What were some skills that you were intentionally learning about?
I found that at this stage of my life, I relate to 2 things. I read 2 books. Mm-hmm. One book was by Clay Christensen called How Will You Measure Your Life? Mm-hmm. And in that, I, in my planning language, always started with vision, which is what I thought a business should be in a generation. It's kind of a generational, aspirational notion. And then you work backwards from there to a mission and objectives and strategies. And I gave all of that in the book. But I reconsidered both in terms of my own life and also because of that book. It fundamentally talked about purpose. And that was a stronger, more powerful way of looking at the world, both for me and for a business, than vision. It had a lot more meat, and I came away from that changed. I thinking about what will I do next after the book is published, and I get through with my publicity and all of that. And I was reading a book by a friend of mine, a woman by the name of Rosabeth Moss Cantor, and Rosabeth wrote a book called Think Outside the Building. And she was talking about people in the next stage of their career after they had finished their first business career and they were now, sake of argument, in their 60s. Well, I'm well past my 60s. But and I picked up the book only because she wrote it, and she's a friend, and she's a brilliant thinker. And I picked it up thinking, well, I've already done this. I've already been through that part of my career. I was a teacher and a board member, and that's behind me. But it just reawakened the notion that I still had another idea and another act to give, which was basically dusting off an idea I had when I was about to become chairman of the International Franchise Association, about developing a complementary set of franchise businesses to take into underserved neighborhoods with minority owners, providing goods and services in the neighborhood. I had an idea in 1968 when we were suffering through the same kind of crises that we're now suffering through. And the point being is that these just happened to me this year. These were 2 books that just happened to me to change my way of thinking about my own self and my own language and how I would define what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do.
Man, I'm so jealous of you now. You successfully run one of the world's most successful business. You're creating stores and opportunities for minority-dominated area. You're on your way to help diversity inclusion. But none of these could have happened if your father sold Dunkin Donuts. One of the most important business decisions is stopping your father from selling the business. If that happened, you probably would have started another business. You may have spent more than 10 years to get that started. Your career and the world could be drastically different. So that moment seems like a defining moment. I'm curious about what challenges were you facing when you were just starting that defines who you are?
You picked a good one. I mean, that was a hard one because my father was a child of the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. He was 8th grade educated. He had lived through challenges and scars that I never lived through. I went to great schools, and even though I had worked my way through college and paid for my education out of my work money and had to borrow money to finish, but I always had the knowledge that I was going to be okay, that I wasn't scratching for the last dollar. So he came from a much what I would call a scarcity background, where I was coming from a background of abundance. So I'm mindful of his concerns, but I had to answer the question, if you don't sell, as different people started to offer us more money, he couldn't get, in 1963, when I was in school, he couldn't get $1.5 million for the business. And then in 1967, I was being offered $7.5 million by Consolidated Foods in the Waldorf Towers, and sitting in front of my brothers and sisters, my mother and my wife. And he was saying, isn't this the right time to sell? Others were selling Mr. Donut. It's been selling. Burger King got sold. Everybody got sold in that era. And I had to say, I don't subscribe to that. I had to figure a way, when do you sell a business? Mm-hmm. And I didn't learn this in school. I basically had to come to it on my own. And the conclusion I came to is, if you are achieving your objectives, mm-hmm. then you shouldn't sell the business. If you run out of energy, vision, the ability to be able to achieve your objectives, then it's time to turn it over to somebody else. Because once the business is gone, it is gone. And that means that by generally non-competes, when you sell a business for a period of time, 1.5 years, 2 years, sometimes 5, you can't go back into the business you know. That means you've got to go into a much higher risk business that you don't know. And you have to go through the whole phase of startup and the decade that it takes to build critical mass. So you could be talking about 20 years out of your life. And no guarantee that you'll have a vehicle like the one that you built and that you've grown up with. And basically, that was my philosophy all the way through. And my mistake was we were growing at 50% a year, which was unsustainable, because I think I've said before, we'd be larger than the gross national product of the United States if we did that. But when we reduced that to 10 to 15%, we were able to accomplish that. So what was, and now I'll now define exactly how that paid off. What a business that couldn't be sold in 1963 for $1.5 million went public, and when I was 30 years old, I was sitting on a business that was worth $100 and some odd million, to what it got sold in 1989 for $325 million, to sold $2.4 billion, and yesterday it was sold again for $8.8 billion. So here we go from a business that couldn't bring $1.5 million 60, 70 years ago. Now, this many years later, it's just been sold for $9 billion. To support my notion that if you can achieve your objectives, and you can see your way clear, you got the energy and the vision to do that, then don't turn it over to somebody else. Keep going.
Wow, that's
a major turning point. But that was important but I also had to go public quickly, because I had to equitize. I promised my father we would equitize his holdings so that he could rest assured that, he would have enough money to live out his life. And he more than had that. I mean, it grew immeasurably more than that. But that was some pressure to go public. So we went public quickly. Came in 63. We were public in 68. The earnings had gone from $100,000 to something like $800,000 in those 5 years.
Wow, I feel like that's literally a $1 billion decision to make. Cut to back in time, I assume you probably didn't know that Dunkin Donuts could go this far.
No, I didn't. All I knew is we had something very successful, and that it satisfied a need. It was growing well, and that so long as it continued to do that. And then my dad would say, "Well, then you're not getting top dollar." I said, yeah, we may miss it by a little bit, but you're forsaking all the upside by selling for $7.5 million to Consolidated Foods.
Yeah, this is such a journey. When I was reading your book, I think the second turning point for Dunkin happens at year 1973. You basically mentioned in the first 5 years, it's amazing. The second 5 years, it's kind of a disaster. You invested a lot of money in R&D, and the vice presidents in those stores aren't growing as fast. But in my perspective, if I was in your shoes, I'd do exactly the same to innovate my company, give people decision-making power. What went wrong?
I hadn't put in place the policies and procedures, and I wasn't utilizing the board. I was making decisions based on intuition about such important things as what was the mission of the business. So we were a focused donut and coffee company in the first 5 years, and incredibly successful, focusing on specific marketing areas, a standardized store. Well, because we were growing at 50%, I wanted to continue to grow at 50%. Mistake, wrong objective. And then decided, well, if I could grow a donut business that fast, maybe if I have 4 or 5 other businesses that were franchised, I could keep that routine up forever. Mistake. Basically, I had run into a guy that was ahead of me in chairs at the International Franchise Association, a guy that started International House of Pancakes. And his idea was to build a franchise business. And he had bought a bunch of companies and he wanted to buy ours. And I wouldn't sell, but I was intrigued by his idea. So in other words, I slid into mission creep based upon my intuition, my eye on the wrong thing, Wall Street, rather than the capabilities of the company. And that was disastrous. And so for the next several years, I was leading my team and everybody over a cliff. And people were losing confidence in me, as rightly they should. And I had to come to some realizations about myself, about what my responsibility as a leader was. I had nobody to blame but myself. I had to change first. So I started to then mature. So I didn't come as a 25-year-old, but as a 35-year-old, I was beginning to get some wisdom. Then we began to build in as a team kind of the mechanisms to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. Better planning, much crisper about what we want to be, what we won't be, what the implications of it are, because I was beginning to do all of those things simultaneously. International development, pushing the area vice presidents through decentralization, open more stores. I was pushing every button and pushing everybody. Again, a company can die from indigestion just as much as it can from starvation. And I was giving the company a case of indigestion, just as my dad had done before. I was making the very same mistake. Luckily, sitting in my chair from a book, reading The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, realized that what arrogance can do, what going off without understanding input from others, particularly those on the front lines, can cost. And that's when we began to set in the procedures and processes to ensure that wouldn't happen again. That's when my board member, Archie Southgate, came and said, you're growing 140, 150 stores a year. What would happen if you went back to 40 stores and paid more attention to the business? I said, I can't do that. So what would happen to the stock and all around? But luckily, because I respected him, started to think, and then we developed a model. And how could we do that? And was that really doable? And lo and behold, we found out we could do it. And so long as we didn't hold ourselves to 50% growth, if we had something closer to 15 or 20%, we could easily do that and slow down, get our arms back around the business, straighten out the mistakes we made, divest ourselves of the false starts of other businesses we had started. And so that's where the input comes in. And then we set up the board to ensure that before I had made any of those kind of moves into the future, that we had a forum that I would telescope all of those way in advance. And people would have a chance, smart people, to gnaw on it, to think about it, to push back, to push me around, to challenge me, to make sure that I really thought it through. Do we really have the resources? Are we strong enough? Can we do it? And that was that turning point. Very important. That kind of failure set us up for success. And sometimes you can have too much success too early, like chocolates for breakfast, where you get too much too soon, which is what happened to me. And then I became arrogant, the darling of Wall Street, start to believe my own press, made all these mistakes.
Yeah, that's such a great lesson. So here are my 2 takeaways. One is you mentioned about the best and the brightest. The learning there is CEO should be constantly communicating with employees working the front line. Be ambitious, but also be realistic and go as fast as your company can operate. Then coming up with goals that are unrealistic to achieve. The other piece of learning is don't be afraid to innovate, but testing it out in a smaller scale before moving on to a larger audience.
It's a constant tension. In there, I think lesson 8, or I can't remember which lesson it was, getting the balance right between experimentation and exploitation. Mm-hmm. When you keep spinning out all these different activities, that's a lot of experimentation. Mm-hmm. And exploiting is to take what you have and really burnish it. So I don't consider new products anything more than exploitation. Experimentation, though, would be new businesses, new geography. International is experimentation. Mm-hmm. Opening Chili's restaurants, taking that license, experimentation. And what is right at one moment in time may not be right for another. That's the art of management, the art of leadership, of getting that balance right in terms of what your resources were. So at that moment in time, going from 140 back to 40 openings was the right thing because we had extended so far. We had to get our arms around the business. And what kept us driving and changing and looking to go back up again was this 15 to 20% earnings per share growth, because you can't do that at 40 when the base is 2,000. You got to have 2 or 3% new distribution. And so you had to build in the infrastructure. The business had to change with the configuration, how we went to market, the Philippine thing I got exposed to in the Philippines had to all change before we could then up the beat again. So because I could go back and relook at that again. So there was a right time and a right place to go back to 140, but it wasn't in 1973, in the middle of gas wars, in the middle of a weakened economy, price and wage controls, the great grain robbery. That wasn't the right time for that.
If you're running the company again in 1968, what would you do differently?
R&D is absolutely essential. I would do a couple of things. Number one, the mistakes I made in R&D weren't that R&D is bad. What I did is I went with a prescription rather than a problem. I went to Arthur D. Little, which was a technical consulting firm, and I asked them to develop a donut machine or a product I saw in California in terms of pies. What I should have done is say, can you help me develop a system where I'm not so reliant upon Donut Man? And it opened up a wider range of options rather than me going with a solution and then tasking them with coming back with an answer. I came with much too prescriptive a solution. I should have never done that. The idea wasn't wrong in terms of utilizing a company. The other thing I learned about that is if it's possible, you try to have enough margin in your business so that you can expense the R&D while you're doing it rather than capitalizing it. Because once you capitalize it and you find out, oh, this doesn't work, this is a mistake, it becomes hard to take a write-off in that year, as I learned in 73 when I got fired. Basically, it becomes hard to back away because not everything works. Things that look promising don't always work. And the third thing I found out about that was generally, unless it's going to be something that fundamentally changes the business immediately and impacts, try not as a public company to talk too much about it, to talk at all about it to analysts, because it then becomes the focus. And again, it becomes too hard when all the analysts are asking, well, what about the donut machine? Or what about your development in Asia? What about, becomes the time? And it's hard to back away and admit, it's not working out publicly. It's easier to do if you keep it quiet and then talk about it when you're ready to go prime time.
Yeah. So basically you test out an idea in a small batch. Exactly. Last year I had Dunkin Donuts in China. To me, a part of what makes Dunkin Donuts is the international expansion. When the first time Dunkin goes abroad, what was the go-to-market strategy? Did you study which part of the world consumed the most amount of donuts? Were you targeting the biggest cities in the world? How did you pick where to put the store?
Basically, what starts it and drives it is the model on earnings growth. And if I start to see, or we as a team, not me, start to see that we're going to have trouble 3 years out or 5 years out or how long, if we keep growing, if same-store sales were dropping from 6% as baby boomers gave way to the next generation and people started eating casual dining, what would we going to do in order to be able to change the business to ensure that we could continue to grow the way we wanted and achieve our objectives? So in the 80s, we basically started 4 initiatives differently than what we had before. Our strategy was go international was one. Mm-hmm. Another was to change the configuration of our store from question mark counter with porcelain cups and a dishwasher to self-service, which changed the business dramatically. Mm-hmm. And a third was to go to market, and instead of having all product sold and made within the 4 walls of the store and sold within the 4 walls of the store, to take the product to other places like convenience stores, gas stations, wherever people work, shop, travel to play. It's a little bit like what Coca-Cola did when they put the product in a bottle and it was sold other than because historically it started only sold over drugstore counters as as a beverage there. When they put it in bottles and traveled, it changed the business. That was what we did. And the fourth thing is we took a license from Chili's to get into the casual dining business because we thought that baby boomers were migrating there and our same-store sales. So that's the impetus to do that. As it turned out, international was harder and longer and wasn't an instant hit. Changing the configuration of the stores was. Broadening distribution over where people work, travel, and play was a huge hit. So two of them hit. Chili's was a bridge too far beyond our competence. We didn't need it, as it turned out. Ultimately, we had to sell it anyways. So as a result of that, how did we come to these things? It basically was driven by our desire to grow earnings at 15%. As we started to see gaps, we started to plant saplings. We weren't sure which ones would hit, which ones wouldn't. Two did, one moderately. The fourth one we ultimately had to leave behind and abandon. And that's how we approached the world. That was what drove our strategy. That's why each is a different era. Each required different responses. And international, basically, I looked at women into the workforce. I could track every country in the world by percentage of women, or at least I tried, percentage of women in the workforce. So in other words, if I was at 1987, I could say India was at 1972 to America in terms of women percentage, because I thought whatever trend was occurring was going to occur. And then I also had to go into countries that would allow me to license my business. So China wouldn't. They wouldn't allow technology to be licensed out. It had to be invested in the country, and owned at least 50%, my recollection was, by a Chinese company. So I couldn't go there. So I had to have the ability to be able to do business and get my royalties out as the franchise business. So I would rank all the countries, by size, and you start to look at the biggest countries in the world. As you start to look at Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Philippines, we started to look at size, women in the workforce, government regulations. And a lot of it initially, honestly, was who came in the door. The thing I wouldn't do in domestic franchising is sell a franchise when anybody just wanted one. It was a little bit different when people came internationally. And international was a big lift for us, for me particularly, because American coffee is an American beverage. And we had a beverage business. Identifying and adapting that to each market is a challenge. And Baskin-Robbins, which is our other brand, I think travels more readily around the world than necessarily does Dunkin. Now, Dunkin management has found ways of being able to adapt the menu, adapt the configuration to the markets. And it's an ongoing process. But it requires a lot of adaptation. You got to listen to the people on the ground in the country. But that's how we pick the countries.
Wow, there are a lot of thoughts goes into it. For people who is not that familiar with the franchise business model, can you tell us more about how Dunkin does it? In your book, I remember at the beginning, franchising means you have to acquire real estate, and when real estate law changes, the store is affected by it. Then you mentioned about every franchise owner has to agree to spend 2% on advertising. You also started Dunkin University to train the store owners. Can you tell us more about how franchise works for Dunkin?
I love franchising, the franchise system of distribution. I think it holds massive benefits for the consumer. It holds massive benefits for the franchisee, the entrepreneur who wants to go into business. I think it holds great benefits for the franchisor. Each of those has a terrific benefit. So basically, it's not a well understood system of distribution. There are 750,000 franchisees in the United States. It's a big business, and it is not only a pathway to a better life for a lot of families, but it also can be an ability to have real wealth creation. There are franchisees in different systems, including Dunkin' Donuts, of people that have networks of hundreds of stores that are worth tens of millions of dollars. Most people don't realize that from the little acorns, massive oaks can grow. So what benefit does it provide for the franchisor? It provides people to come in, and once the pump is primed by finding your own real estate, because generally speaking, most landlords wouldn't build for franchisees without a brand name. Mm-hmm. So you have to sell to the franchise company. So in order to build the brand, you have to go on the real estate yourself, ultimately. Mm-hmm. But then after that, you have to have standards to pick the right locations, but you don't need the capital to do that. You can rely upon franchisees, local franchisees and markets for that. So they provide some capital. They provide a lot of wonderful online expertise because they have skin in the game. They are not employees. They are basically people who are business people who they and their families, are making their livelihood from that business. So you got a high level of competence. You get great ideas from franchisees. A lot of our best ideas come from our franchise community. So those are all the benefits from a franchisor's point of view as to why he liked franchising. And it allows you to expand. From the franchisee's point of view, going into business, it telescopes the Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours down to a matter of weeks. It takes the failure rate. It's reported. I have different figures. Some say 50%, some say 80% of all small businesses fail within the first 5 years. Well, franchising is a small fraction of that in terms of failure. Maybe 5 or 10% of stores don't make it, if that even. So the rate of failure for franchising, the ability to be able to get mass buying power. So if you pay in, it's now 4%. It used to be 2. It's gone to 4, maybe even 5 in some markets. So if you have $1 million Dunkin' Donuts shop, you're paying in $40,000 or $50,000 in advertising. But you are getting the benefit of $200 to $300 million worth of advertising because you're getting all of the buying power of all of that brand advertising. So, it's a huge advantage. And on purchasing for goods, when we bought the Mr. Donut chain and rebadged them, our purchasing cooperative buying system that we had developed in the 70s, the average Mr. Donut store immediately saved 10% on their food purchases by joining our buying co-op because it was so efficient in terms of taking all the costs out. It was a co-op system where the franchisees own the points of distribution. So there's huge advantages to the franchisee, huge advantages to the franchisor. And then you get into communities where you have these independent business people that if you look behind the curtain, you're going to find the John Deere tractor franchisee is going to be a pillar of community. An automobile dealership, which isn't a franchisee, a dealership, but like a franchise. In Miami, Bremen, Cadillac, among the Bach and Boston, among the pillars of society, of the communities. Same thing with Dunkin' Donuts. You'll find some of these franchise owners are the pillars of a community. So they're independent businessmen, but they belong to a big system. So they're in business for themselves, but they're not in business by themselves.
Wow, you convinced me. If I'm trying to invest in building a Dunkin' Donuts in my area, how much money do I need and what's the process like?
It varies. They sell a territory and that territory has to be developed. They don't sell generally individual stores. So you have go online, you go to the company. I'm not up to date on the exact amounts today, but they would let you know in terms of what it requires. But my guess is it's getting to be substantial. It's probably you have to have net worth maybe of $250,000, something like that, to buy a franchise today. You don't have to have that in cash, but you have to have a net worth in terms of homes, houses, father that signs for you, whatever it may be. But you can easily go to the company's site and get in touch with a franchise sales representative. They can tell it very quickly what area, what might be required, what the minimum is, and how to get started.
Yeah, it's such an interesting model. Bob, we're at the end of our interview. I have some fire rounds for you. What's your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book, I think, would probably be The Best and the Brightest because it had the most transformational effect on me.
Oh, my current favorite book is this book.
Oh, that's sweet. That's nice. Yeah, that's my favorite book.
Yeah, of course.
That's a book where I knew what I was putting in. The others are ones where they fill my head up. When the student is ready, a teacher will appear.
Yeah, of course. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Oh, my. I would say my teammates, my direct reports. They were the ones, and franchise owners. They lifted me up when I was down. And I have been down. And came to my aid when I needed help. And so there were different people at different times. But that 2 groups of people in there are really literally hundreds of people who really, really made the difference in me and made the difference in our business.
Absolutely. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh my goodness. Barack Obama.
What are you guys going to talk about?
I would just talk about his life, his presentation, his skills. I'm in awe and admiration. I also like Bill and Melinda Gates. So maybe those three. Those are my heroes.
Where can we find you if you're not at work? So what's your hobby on the other hand? Yeah.
You can find me, until I hurt myself, I was in Pilates 3 times a week. Or you could find me traveling with my grandchildren. So we've been to Africa, we've been all over Europe. And as soon as the pandemic is over, we're off for one, New York, and another, it's either going to be the Middle East or we'll go back to Africa. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming onto the show today, Bob.
Thank you very much, Grace. It was wonderful.
All right. That's all we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Smart Venture Podcast. If you like it, please leave us a quick review and hit subscribe so you don't miss any tips from the experts. If you want to receive our updates, please leave your email at smartventurepod.com. If you want to connect with me, all my socials are at Grace Gong GG. Beside LinkedIn, it's just Grace Gong. I'd love to connect with you and let me know your thought about the show. Now you can also listen to Smart Venture Podcast on YouTube. Go to smartventurepod.com, click the YouTube link on the top banner. Don't forget to hit subscribe and smash the like button. See you next time.